Putumayo Jungle, Colombia, 1997. 8 elite soldiers entered sector Garganta que llora. Only one returned, his mouth moving with the exact voices of men who never came back. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a chronicle where what stalks you isn't just hunting your body. It's harvesting your identity. Plan Colombia, 1997. The Colombian Civil War had raged for decades, but now American boots were on jungle soil. U.S. Special Forces operated in classified red zones, where even the Colombian military feared to patrol. The official mandate: dismantle the cartels. The unofficial objective: counter the growing bioweapon threat intelligence had confirmed in the Putumayo Basin. Sergeant Jacob Keene stood at attention as Colonel Matheson briefed him. Rain hammered the tin roof of the forward operating base. Keene was a combat medic, 34, Gulf War veteran with Somalia experience. His file noted, emotional detachment beneficial to combat scenarios, a polite way of saying his nightmares kept him focused. 17 locals, 12 cartel operatives, 4 DEA informants, all vanished within a 60-mile radius of this location, Matheson said, tapping a map. Locals call it La Garganta que llora, the crying throat. Keene studied the mission parameters. 8-man team. 4 Green Berets, 4 Colombian Jungla Commandos. Primary objective: locate suspected bioweapon facility. Secondary objective: determine cause of anomalous cattle deaths, all found completely drained of blood, with surgical precision. The indigenous Inga tribes refuse to enter this region, Matheson continued. They speak of Uricoechea, a memory demon that hunts trauma. Colonial records show similar legends dating back to the 1500s. Keene remained expressionless, but his pulse quickened. He remembered Somalia, the village ambush, the little girl bleeding out under his hands. Her voice sometimes haunted his dreams, speaking words he couldn't understand. Any specific medical threat I should prepare for? Keene asked. That's what you're going to tell us, Matheson replied. Gear up. Your team moves at 0400. Matheson slid a final photograph across the desk. Cattle arranged in an unnaturally perfect circle, their necks bearing identical puncture wounds. The locals have another name for what hunts there: Chupacabra, the goat sucker. As Keene turned to leave, Matheson added, Sergeant, the Inga have a saying about this entity. No entra sin tu dolor. It doesn't enter unless it feels your pain. The storm intensified as Keene walked toward the barracks. In the spaces between thunderclaps, he heard something impossible, his own voice, singing a Somali lullaby he'd never learned. Keene stepped off the UH-60 Black Hawk at 0600, morning heat already rising from the jungle floor in rippling waves. Captain Ramirez greeted him, a weathered Jungla commando whose face told stories his personnel file omitted. The yellow Commando Jungla patch on his shoulder was faded from countless operations. My wife made me wear this, Ramirez said, noticing Keene eyeing the worn Catholic medallion around his neck. She died last spring. Cancer. Said it would protect me from the things that lurk in these forests. His fingers traced the metal's edge, the things her grandmother warned about. The team assembled around a topographical map marked with red X's. 7 livestock incidents in a month, all with the same signature: precision punctures, complete exsanguination, no struggle. Staff Sergeant Miller, a Green Beret with haunted eyes, pointed to the biolab coordinates. Intelligence suggests the cartel captured something. We've intercepted communications referring to Proyecto Uricoechea, named after the scientist who first documented the Chupacabra phenomenon in this region in 1952. Torres, the youngest Jungla commando, crossed himself. My grandfather was Inga. He said Uricoechea doesn't drink blood for sustenance. It drinks memories. His voice dropped. It learns from what it takes. The team prepped gear as Keen studied local fauna reports. Nothing explained the precision of the wounds or the perfect blood drainage. At sunset, they heard a commotion at the perimeter. A local farmer arrived, hands trembling as he spoke rapidly to Ramirez. "Another attack," Ramirez translated. 3 kilometers east, fresh. They reached the site after nightfall. 3 cattle lay in the clearing, hides unmarked except for small symmetrical punctures along their necks. No blood remained, no signs of predators, just dead weight on dry ground. Keen knelt to examine the wounds. "These weren't made by teeth or claws," he noted. "The edges are too clean, almost surgical." A sudden silence fell over the jungle. The constant insect chorus simply stopped. The team formed a defensive perimeter, weapons raised. Then they heard it, a whisper from the tree line. "It feeds on memory first," came a child's voice, speaking in perfect Somali. Keen froze. Those were the exact words the dying girl in Somalia had spoken, words he'd never shared with anyone. Ramirez's flashlight beam swept the jungle edge. What did it say? But Keen couldn't answer, because the voice had spoken in a language none of these men should understand. From deeper in the jungle came a metallic scraping sound. Lightning briefly illuminated the tree line, revealing something that shouldn't be there. A broken metal cage, partially hidden under vines, bearing a spray-painted label still visible. Bio 773A, Chupacabra de la Selva. Dawn broke over the Putumayo Basin as the team approached the biolab coordinates. The facility wasn't what they expected, just scattered, burnt-out prefabricated structures. The jungle already reclaimed portions of the clearing, vines crawling over charred equipment. Inside the main structure, laboratory equipment lay shattered across concrete floors. Blood painted the walls in arcing patterns. Computer terminals remained intact, but had been meticulously emptied of hard drives. Filing cabinets stood open, their contents burned in small, controlled fires. In a back room, Keen discovered a single notebook, partially burned, lodged beneath an overturned refrigeration unit. The cover bore a Cartel insignia and Proyecto Uricoechea, 1997. He flipped through pages of chemical formulas and biological classifications. Most were destroyed, but a single entry remained legible. Subject exhibits unprecedented mimicry capacities. Audio analysis confirms perfect replication of researcher Vasquez's voice patterns 24 hours after first feeding. PET scans indicate temporal lobe activity suggesting memory absorption rather than simple audio repetition. Another passage, partially burned. Indigenous mythology describes Yachai Supe as an entity that evolved in response to the Spanish conquest. When colonizers massacred villages, the collective trauma birthed something that could preserve memories through blood. Inga shamans contained it using specialized rituals, until excavation for our facility disturbed the sacred boundary stones. Shouting erupted outside. They found Torres backing away from the tree line, weapon trained on shadows. "I heard my mother," he insisted, sweat pouring down his face. "She died when I was 7, but that was her voice, telling me about the scar on my shoulder that no one else knows about." "I heard her too," said Miller quietly. "Not his mother, my daughter, telling me why she ran away last year." As night fell, the team huddled around infrared lamps. Jenkins, a Green Beret sniper, refused to sleep, claiming each time he closed his eyes, he heard his brother whispering from Somalia, his brother who died in Mogadishu 4 years earlier. A twig snapped in the darkness. 8 flashlights converged on the sound. There stood a man in ragged clothing, eyes reflecting light like a nocturnal animal's. Before anyone could react, he spoke, using Torres' exact voice. Mama always said my birthmark looked like the Virgin Mary. That's how she knew I would survive the fever that killed my sister. Torres screamed, a primal sound of violation, and fired 3 rounds into the stranger's chest. The body crumpled to the jungle floor. When they reached it, they found only an empty cartel uniform, soaked with fresh blood but hollow, as if whatever had been inside simply dissolved. And from the darkness all around them, the jungle whispered back their secret pains in their own voices. The radio crackled to life at 0200 hours. All attempts to contact command had failed for 6 hours. The team huddled in a defensive formation, backs to each other as rain battered the jungle canopy. "We need evac," Miller insisted. Mission parameters specified immediate extraction if team members exhibited psychological distress. Keane watched Torres, who hadn't spoken since firing at the apparition. The commando's eyes darted between his teammates as if seeing strangers wearing familiar faces. "Something's blocking the signal," Wilson reported, adjusting radio frequencies. "Or jamming us." Jenkins suddenly stood, his weapon dropping to the ground. "It's inside me," he whispered, hands trembling. "I can feel it reading everything, every memory, every secret." His voice shifted mid-sentence, becoming the soft southern accent of his dead brother. "Remember when we found that snake in the creek, Jimmy? How you cried until I carried you home." Before anyone could stop him, Jenkins pressed his sidearm against his temple and fired. "Jesus Christ!" Miller shouted, rushing to the fallen soldier. Keane was already there, medical training taking over. But it was too late. Jenkins had executed himself with military precision. "We move now," Ramirez ordered. 2-man teams, 5-meter spread. They left Jenkins' body behind, wrapped in a poncho. By noon, they'd lost contact with Miller and Rodriguez. The radio emitted only a high-pitched whine when they tried to locate the missing soldiers. An hour later, Wilson vanished during a guard rotation. The 3 remaining men, Keane, Ramirez, and Torres, found temporary shelter beneath a massive ceiba tree. Torres suddenly laughed, an unnerving sound. "My Maria told me something last night," he said, voice unnervingly calm. "She said none of you are real anymore." In one fluid motion, Torres unsheathed his combat knife and sliced his own throat, arterial blood spraying across Keane's face. Ramirez grabbed his fallen weapon, aiming wildly into the jungle. "Come out," he screamed. "Face me like a man." From the darkness came Miller's voice. "I never told anyone what happened in Fallujah." About the children in the school basement. Ramirez fired until his magazine emptied. Then came Rodriguez's voice, speaking directly behind them. "My brother killed himself because of what I said at Christmas dinner." Keane watched in horror as Ramirez broke. The hardened commando dropped to his knees, pressing his hands against his ears, sobbing uncontrollably. When he looked up at Keane, his eyes were vacant. "Your turn," Ramirez said, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was Jenkins, Wilson, Miller, Rodriguez, and Torres, speaking in perfect unison through Ramirez's mouth. Ramirez reached for his sidearm, placed it under his chin, and fired. Keane ran. Alone now, he crashed through the jungle, the voices of his entire team calling his name from every direction. Each one knew his secrets. Each one recited the words of the dying Somali girl with perfect accuracy. From his belt, the radio crackled to life. Through the static came Colonel Matheson's voice. "Keane, report your position." Keane knew he should respond, but something stopped him, because the voice on the radio wasn't asking where he was. It was asking who he still was. 3 weeks later, Walter Reed Medical Center, Psychiatric Evaluation Wing. The camera's red light blinked steadily in the corner of the sterile room. 2 figures sat across a metal table, Sergeant Jacob Keene and Dr. Eliza Chambers, lead psychiatric evaluator for SOCOM's Post-Traumatic Assessment Division. This session is classified UMBR-A level, Dr. Chambers stated for the recording. Subject interview 47 with Sergeant Jacob Keene, sole survivor of Operation Uricoechea. Keene sat perfectly upright, hands folded on the table. His face showed no emotion, his uniform pressed to regulation standards despite 3 weeks in isolation. Medical notes indicated his physical recovery was remarkable. No infections, no lasting injuries beyond minor dehydration and exposure. The official report stated that a search team found Keene sitting calmly at the extraction point, his equipment neatly arranged beside him. The remainder of his team was never recovered despite extensive search operations. You've been cooperative with all medical procedures, Dr. Chambers noted. Yet your account of events remains inconsistent with the evidence. She slid 8 photographs across the table, each member of the team, including Keene himself. You claim your team members succumbed to hallucinations and committed suicide. Yet you haven't explained how you alone survived when the entity targeted traumatic memories. Keene smiled, a perfect, practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. The jungle is unpredictable. Memory becomes unreliable under stress. Dr. Chambers pressed a button on the recording device. A child's voice filled the room, speaking in Somali. Keene's eyes widened slightly. This was recorded during your sleep cycle 2 nights ago, Dr. Chambers explained. You were speaking in a language you claim no knowledge of. The translation refers to events in Mogadishu, 1993. Combat stress manifests in unusual ways, Keene replied mechanically. Indeed. Dr. Chambers opened a folder. 3 separate debrief specialists have requested transfer after sessions with you. She removed a photograph of a middle-aged man in a CIA windbreaker. Agent Peterson conducted your initial field debrief. He suffered a breakdown after you spoke to him about his son's drowning in 1989, using the exact words his son used before death. Keene's expression remained unchanged. Yesterday, Dr. Chambers continued, her voice trembling slightly. You told me about my husband's car accident. You described the precise shade of blue of the vehicle that struck him. You used his exact last words. She paused. I never told you about my husband. She slid a classified document across to him. There's an addendum to your mission report. It catalogs the incident under biological anomaly. Chupacabra 773A, mimetic/neurological vector. The cartel wasn't creating bioweapons, she continued. According to indigenous consultants we've interviewed, they disturbed something ancient, something the Inga had contained for centuries using ritual boundaries. Keene stared at the document, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was softer, feminine, with a slight Boston accent. Dr. Chambers' own voice. You think the Chupacabra was the monster, he said, using her exact speech patterns. It wasn't. It was just the name we gave to the monster's echo. What your husband saw before the truck hit him was just its first form. Dr. Chambers knocked over her chair as she stumbled backward. Keene remained seated, his posture perfect, smiling that empty smile. The camera continued recording as alarms began to sound throughout the facility. Fort Detrick, Maryland, 4 months after Operation Uricoechea. The secure conference room hummed with air purifiers. 5 individuals sat around a polished table. 2 military officers, a CDC virologist, a behavioral psychologist, and a representative from Defense Intelligence. Major General Harris, gray-haired with penetrating eyes, slid a dossier across the table. Classified, Chupacabra, 773, a containment protocols. I've assembled this team because you each have clearance to know what happened following the Putumayo incident, Harris began, and because each of you has specialized knowledge we need. Dr. Rivera, the CDC virologist, opened her copy. These blood samples from Sergeant Keene show something unprecedented. Not a virus in the conventional sense, but a prion-like protein that affects neurotransmitter pathways in the amygdala and hippocampus, the brain's emotion and memory centers. The indigenous Inga have documented this phenomenon for centuries, explained Ms. Clark from Defense Intelligence. Their oral histories describe Yache Supe as an entity born during the Spanish conquest. When colonizers massacred villages in 1542, the collective trauma of an entire people crystallized into something that could preserve their memories through blood. Inga shamans contained it using specialized ritual boundaries, she continued, until the cartel's excavation disturbed those protections. What they thought was a rare jungle predator was actually the physical manifestation of a psychic parasite. Security footage played on the wall monitor, Keene in a containment cell, speaking fluently in 12 different languages. The camera showed him addressing guards by names they had never given him, revealing personal secrets that made hardened soldiers weep. It's not a beast, Dr. Farrow, the behavioral psychologist, explained. It's a memory virus, a trauma parasite that transfers through empathy. And Keene? Asked the Navy captain. Terminated, Harris replied flatly. But not before he had contact with 73 military personnel across 3 facilities. Dr. Rivera shuddered. If trauma is the vector and empathy the transmission medium, then war is the perfect breeding ground. Harris finished. Every combat zone, every traumatized soldier becomes a potential carrier. The traditional Chupacabra myth was a red herring, Ms. Clark said, a deliberate misdirection. For centuries, people thought it hunted animals for blood. They never realized it was hunting humans for something far more valuable: their pain, their identity. Harris distributed sealed orders. Your task is containment. Track every person who had contact with Keene or secondary cases. Security footage from Walter Reed appeared on screen. Dr. Chambers, sitting alone in a therapy room, speaking with multiple voices simultaneously. The footage showed her with 3 soldiers, newly returned from Afghanistan, leaning forward as she asked about their combat experiences. We're not dealing with mythology, Harris concluded. We're dealing with something that uses myth as camouflage, something that has evolved specifically to transmit through our most human quality, our capacity to share in each other's suffering. God help us if this reaches the VA system, Farrow whispered. Thousands of traumatized veterans, counselors trained to absorb their pain. Harris closed his folder. That's why we're here, to ensure it never does. Present day, Veteran Affairs. Medical Center, Washington, D.C. Dr. Rebecca Winters reviewed her notes before the morning's therapy group. 6 months into her position as lead counselor for the Combat Trauma Recovery Program, she had developed a reputation for remarkable success with severe PTSD cases. Veterans who wouldn't speak to other therapists opened up to her. Soldiers haunted by unspeakable memories found comfort in her sessions. Her supervisor called it a gift, her ability to truly understand their pain. Rebecca knew better. The dreams had started 3 weeks after treating a Marine who'd served in Colombia in the late 90s. Each night, she heard voices that weren't hers, experienced memories she'd never lived. At first, she'd sought help, even checked herself into psychiatric observation. Then she realized the power it gave her. Staff Sergeant Michael Corbin entered her office precisely at 0900. recently returned from his third Afghanistan deployment. His file noted severe combat trauma, survivor's guilt, and resistance to traditional therapy. "Good morning, Sergeant Corbin," Rebecca said warmly. The man nodded stiffly, hyper-vigilant eyes scanning the room for threats that weren't there. "They pulled 6 of us out of that valley," Corbin said suddenly, words rushing out. 6 out of 23. I keep hearing them calling for medevac on the radio. Keep seeing Rodriguez trying to hold his intestines in with his bare hands. Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "The dust was so thick that day," she said softly. "It coated your throat when you tried to call in coordinates. The smell of copper and cordite mixed with the mountain air." Corbin froze. "How could you know that?" "I never told anyone about the dust." "You mentioned it earlier," she lied smoothly, but she hadn't needed him to tell her. She could see it perfectly, could taste the dust, could feel the weight of his rifle as he dragged Rodriguez behind a rock outcropping. Inside her mind, something stirred hungrily. It had been feeding well these past months, growing stronger, gathering voices, collecting traumas like precious gems. "The thing about pain," Rebecca said, using words that weren't entirely her own, "is that it connects us. When you share your burden with me, I can help carry it." On her desk sat a framed photograph of her with her therapy team. 5 other counselors she had personally trained, each now running their own PTSD programs across the country, each carrying a fragment of what had once been trapped in a cage, labeled BIO 773A/Chupacabra de la Selva. The military had contained Keen, had tracked his immediate contacts, but they never found Patient Zero, the Marine who'd been stationed near the original Colombian operation, who'd later sought treatment for nightmares about voices in the jungle, the Marine who'd sat across from Rebecca 3 years ago, just as Corbin sat now. "Let's begin today's session," Rebecca said, her voice carrying undertones of Keen's clinical detachment. "Tell me what haunts you most, and I promise you won't carry it alone." As Corbin began to speak, Rebecca felt the presence inside her listening intently, savoring each painful memory. It had evolved far beyond its jungle origins, no longer hunting for blood in the darkness, but for trauma freely given in sterile government offices. Her calendar notification blinked. Tomorrow, she would train 20 new military psychologists on her breakthrough PTSD treatment protocols. 20 specialists who would each counsel hundreds of traumatized soldiers. "Don't worry," she whispered, echoing words spoken in a jungle clearing decades ago. "We've been here before." And behind her gentle therapist's smile, countless voices whispered in perfect unison. If this chronicle from the War Maestro's archive left you questioning the voices in your own mind, take a moment to join our ranks. Listen carefully to ensure the whispers you hear are truly your own. Then subscribe to access more classified military horrors. Activate the notification bell. You'll want to know immediately when our next covert file is declassified. Share this account with fellow horror enthusiasts who understand that sometimes the most terrifying enemies aren't those we face on the battlefield, but the ones we bring home within us. Remember, some traumas are never meant to be shared, but the entity is always listening for new voices to collect.